Hey, welcome to Ellipse Academy. We are going to discuss mobility training. I call this unit Mobility Training 101. So this is going to be the fundamentals of how we train mobility, what mobility is, and some best practices moving forward. Okay, number one, what is mobility? And the easiest way to think about it is mobility equals flexibility plus strength. So mobility is increasing your functional range of motion. When we train mobility, several physiological and neurological processes occur that allow us to improve range of motion, control, and movement efficiency. The movement efficiency is very, very important to this. Why does stretching often not work? Now, when most people think of getting more flexible, they focus on just static stretching. Um, the reality of stretching doesn't fix some of the biggest problems, which are weakness, poor movement patterns, or nervous system guarding. On top of that, which is unrelated to the fact that it's just stretching, is most people just lack consistency and progressions. So rather than thinking of stretching as how you create flexibility, think of it as a component of flexibility. And the key to this is strengthening and retaining movement patterns. Okay, so what happens when we train mobility? And we're going to talk about how to do this. But first, what happens when we train mobility properly? Number one, we have neurological adaptations, meaning we override our body's protective measures, like the stretch reflex, meaning when we have too much elongation in a muscle, the stretch reflex will kick in and will cause a concentric contraction, guarding that muscle from stretching further. Our body thinks it's going to be overstretched and is going to lead to injury. We need to learn to train our nervous system to allow us to go through these long ranges of motion. Also, we need to improve motor control, coordination, and joint awareness. As we start exploring new ranges, often being in those ranges we can equate to like brushing your teeth with your left hand. Your body is not comfortable in those ranges of motion and often struggles. We want to spend time there and develop these new neural pathways, developing coordination, motor control, and overall joint proprioception. Then we have tissue adaptation. So this is very similar to what we would see in regular strength training. It's just going to be through a longer range of motion in the muscle. So we're going to see increased glide in the fascia. We're going to increase, obviously, strength in the end range, which we spoke about earlier, and increased joint health in the tendons and ligaments through collagen turnover. So rather, the ligaments are specific to the joints. The tendon is what connects the muscle to the bone. And then we have joint and capsule adaptation. So we increase synovial fluid, reducing friction, nourishing the cartilage. We keep joint capsules flexible, and we improve alignment. Now, the alignment piece is really important because a lot of people that have issues, like orthopedic issues down the road, whether it's like hip replacements, knee replacements, stuff that's very common for elderly people, a lot of those aren't due to acute trauma. A lot of those are due to chronic malalignments, whether it's, an easy example would be really tight in the anterior hip flexor region through maybe the rec fem and the TFL, putting a lot of stress on the ball and socket joint of the hip. And that could lead to premature wear and tear. Also, maybe their glutes don't activate that well because of those positionings, meaning there's just so much more stress on the joint. A really good way to think about proper training is that it's not the bones holding up the muscles, it's the muscles supporting the skeletal system. Systemic effects, which is blood flow and recovery, which are the same effects that we see, like the enhanced circulation, delivering oxygen, removing waste. This is through things called like capillarization, when we have increased blood waves, which allows us just to get more blood in, more blood out, bringing in the good stuff, removing the bad stuff. But also what happens, which is not what occurs in regular strength training, is we learn to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. We reduce stress and we aid recovery. So a lot of this is getting your nervous system to actually calm down. Long-term structural changes are the ultimate goal. So we do all of these things so that our body, which is constantly remodeling, will remodel in a way where we have balanced positioning. Like example would be ideally a neutral pelvic position, both anterior, posterior, and laterally. We have proper joint, proper pressure on joints where we're not compensating one side to the other, etc., etc. This also helps prevent age-related stiffness, keeping joints healthy for life. Now, these sometimes sound like platitudes, and sometimes they are, but the reality is the more our muscles can work through a long range of motion, the healthier we're going to be when we get to those ranges of motion. The difference would be someone that drops something on the ground who's elderly and can squat down and pick them up versus someone who has to bend at the hips, putting undue pressure on the hips because they lack the musculature and mobility to do it. How do we integrate this into training? So the first thing is preparing the nervous system. So activation, inhibition. What we want to do here is we want to prep the body to start being able to elongate the muscle. And the first step is making sure that the nervous system is not going to guard. Once we get there, we expand and strengthen the range of motion. Okay, so this is getting into some deeper ranges of motion. Then we look at integrating mobility into real movement. So example that I'm going to give next is in the weight room, so how that would look in certain drills. And then finally, holding static positions. This can help us reinforce neuromuscular adaptations and promote long-term remodeling. So examples here would be, the key points are mobility training is more than just stretching. It's a combination of neurological reprogramming, tissue remodeling, and strength development. The best mobility work builds control in new ranges, not just passive flexibility. Consistency is crucial because the nervous system will revert back to old movement patterns if new ones aren't reinforced. And this is one of the points that really challenges people, especially people that are used to traditional strength and conditioning. So if you're used to getting really strong in the bench press and now you're pursuing mobility, it's going to be potentially very frustrating because this piece can really start messing with people. Right? Because they don't understand why they're just not getting where they want to go. Now, they may be doing the work, but if we're not doing the work properly and we're constantly putting our nervous system in a position where it's guarding us, then we're also not going to see the benefits of the mobility work we do, or at least not the full potential of them. So, if we go back to this, we are looking at expand and strengthen the range of motion, integrate mobility into real movement, and hold static positions. So these are some easier examples. So we would be creating we'd be adding range of motion through dowel dislocations, meaning this takes us through extension and flexion of the shoulder. Okay. Then it would be showing an example of a dip where dips add a ton of stress in mobility of the shoulder on extension. So this really challenges the extension of the shoulder. This is a practical application for a lot of people if our practical application is being in the gym. And then the static stretch would be something like a wall lat stretch. Now, understandably, these two movements, this is training shoulder flexion, this is training shoulder extension, but this example is being brought into play because we're training both in the mobility drill that we begin with. Then an example here would be bringing in the elongated range of motion, putting a ton of stress on strengthening that range of motion, and then getting into our static stretch position for training hip flexors. So you can see here, we have an elongated hip flexor, including the rec fem, because we have knee flexion and hip extension, and we have a tremendous amount of load because we're using our whole body weight against it. As opposed to this position where we still have full hip extension and knee flexion, but this is our back leg. So this movement is a lot more passive here, where the front leg is the main driver. And then the wall stretch would be, again, getting into full extension and full flexion, so getting the rec fem into full elongated position. And this would allow us to keep tension on the muscle as we allow it to calm down and work through some passive ranges of motion, or more passive ranges of motion. Then getting into our mobility drills on the posterior chain, I've got a light Jefferson curl as going through an elongated range of motion. The functional would be getting into a heavy RDL and then a forward fold to get into that more extreme range of motion on the passive side, or rather on the static side. Standing rotations, bigger range of motion, functional with a rotational row, and then our more static drill for elongated hold to help integrate the CNS and some remodeling. And then here, my examples would be squat with reach. We get into an extreme range of motion because not only do we have the overhead position, but we have the rotation, then we have overhead squats, then getting into our hangs. And this gives us an example of how we integrate that in the programming that everybody in this program has been going through. We all have different examples of how that specifically plays out, and everybody has different strengths and weaknesses. But the biggest thing to remember is that we want to focus on allowing the body to adapt properly. One of the biggest mistakes I see is people jump into stretches, either, sitting on the phone and just shooting the shit with somebody rather than focusing, or they go too intense and don't give their body time to relax. One of the things that I tell people recently who are battling with this is if you just go aggressively into a stretch, the muscle belly itself is going to resist. So we're actually going to be pulling on the ends, whether it's the origin or insertion are usually what are going to experience the most trauma. And we're not actually doing ourselves any good by expanding the muscle belly. So I hope this brings a little bit more light on how we approach mobility from a practical point of view. And I will be working on some media and some educational stuff that's a little bit more advanced, but I think this is a really good intro. Okay, just drop any comments below, and stoked to get to them. Cheers.